Night comes differently to the Nevada desert. It does not arrive suddenly. There is no clear moment when day ends and darkness begins. Instead, the light slowly loosens its grip, thinning out across the flat horizon, fading grain by grain until the land seems to exhale. Colors drain away. Sound softens. Distance stretches. What remains is space, wide, quiet, and patient. Out here, under a sky that feels unusually tall, the desert becomes something more than land. It becomes a canvas, a place where time slows enough for thoughts to drift without urgency, a place where questions do not demand answers, only acknowledgement. Far from cities, far from roads with names, the Nevada desert holds long silences. Some of them are geological, formed over millions of years. Others are human-made, laid down carefully, deliberately, during a much shorter span of history. And somewhere within those overlapping silences lies a place most people know only by a number. Area 51. The name itself feels heavier at night. Not louder, just heavier. It carries decades of speculation, curiosity, and quiet insistence. And yet, for all the stories told about it, the place itself remains remarkably still, unmoving, unbothered by the attention it has attracted. Tonight, there is no intention to solve anything. No secrets will be uncovered here. No locked doors opened. No forbidden diagrams unfolded across a table. Instead, this is a slow walk along the edges of a place that has spent much of its existence just beyond the edges of public view. This is not an investigation. It is a settling. Imagine the desert floor under moonlight. Pale, almost silver. Dry lake beds stretching outward, smooth and unmarked, as if waiting for something that never quite arrives. Mountains in the distance hold their shape without explanation. They have seen more questions come and go than answers ever could. Somewhere within this vastness sits Groom Lake, Nevada. A dry salt flat surrounded by low ridges, quiet even. By desert standards. On maps for many years, it appeared as little more than an unremarkable feature. A blank space with no labels that might draw attention. And for a long time, that was enough. Around it, the Nevada test and training range spreads wide, a patchwork of restricted land woven together by invisible boundaries. Boundaries not marked by fences or walls, but by rules, airspace designations, and absence. The kind of absence that feels intentional, though never explained. Above it all, the sky opens into controlled emptiness. Restricted airspace, designated R4808N, stretches upward. Pilots know not to enter. Civilian aircraft arc around it gently, as if respecting something unseen. From the ground, nothing marks where permission ends and prohibition begins. The sky looks the same everywhere. Blue by day, black by night. And that sameness is part of the story. Because Area 51, despite its reputation, has never been loud. It has never announced itself. It did not begin as a symbol, or even as a secret in the way people imagine secrets now. In its earliest years, it was simply a place chosen for its quiet, its distance, its ability to be overlooked. In the early 1950s, during the Cold War, the United States was learning how to see farther than ever before. Not through curiosity, but necessity. The world had shifted into a posture of vigilance. Information became valuable. Altitude became power. And invisibility, both literal and metaphorical, became an asset. Records suggest that Groom Lake was selected not because it was mysterious, but because it was forgettable, remote, flat, shielded by miles of uninhabited desert. It was a place where work could be done without interruption and where mistakes could vanish into heat and distance. At the time, few could have imagined what the name would come to represent. But names accumulate weight slowly, like dust settling on an unused road. Over the decades, Area 51 became less a location and more a container, a place where unanswered questions gathered, where sightings, rumors, declassified memos, and second-hand accounts all seemed to drift, circling without landing. Each generation added something new, not always facts, but interpretations, expectations, hopes, fears. And yet, through it all, the place itself remained unchanged in character. Quiet, controlled, measured. This documentary is not about revealing what is hidden behind its gates. Instead, it is about the idea of a map that was never meant to be seen. Not a physical map, folded and stamped, but a conceptual one. A map of layers. There is the public layer. What appears on official charts? What can be acknowledged without consequence? Then there is the restricted layer. Known to some, invisible to most. Governed by clearance levels and compartmentalization. And finally, there is the imagined layer. Built collectively over time by those who stand outside the fence. This layer is not drawn with coordinates, but with questions. It is shaped by what is missing rather than what is shown. When people speak of the map the public never saw, they are often speaking about this third layer. The mental geography that forms when information is partial, delayed, or denied. A landscape created not by confirmation, but by curiosity left unattended. It is important to say this gently. Curiosity is not a flaw. It is a human reflex. When a space is closed, the mind leans toward it. When a story stops abruptly, imagination continues the sentence. In this way, Area 51 has functioned less like a fortress and more like a mirror. It reflects back whatever the observer brings with them. For some, it is a symbol of advanced technology. For others, a quiet proof of extraterrestrial contact. For many, it is simply a reminder that not everything is shared equally. Tonight, there is no need to decide which of these reflections is correct. Instead, we move slowly, deliberately, as if walking across the desert at night, careful not to disturb the surface. Each step light, each thought allowed to drift away if it becomes too sharp. This is a descent, not into danger, but into calm, a guided narrowing of focus. The farther we move from the noise of explanation, the easier it becomes to rest inside uncertainty. Think of the desert again. How it looks unchanged whether secrets exist beneath it or not. The ground does not react to speculation. The stars above do not rearrange themselves around belief. Area 51 exists within this indifference. It does its work, whatever that may be, without commentary, without acknowledgement, without concern for how it is imagined elsewhere. And perhaps that is why it has remained so compelling, because it refuses to resolve itself. As this story unfolds, there will be moments of history, glimpses of structure, suggestions of hidden layers. But they are offered softly. Nothing here needs to be held tightly. Nothing requires memorization. You are not being asked to stay alert. You are being invited to rest. To let the desert night do what it has always done best, stretch time, blur edges, and make space for thoughts to loosen their grip. To listen without effort. To wonder without urgency. Somewhere out there, Groom Lake sits quietly under the stars. Aircraft do not fly overhead. Roads do not lead directly to it. Maps, depending on who is looking, may or may not acknowledge its presence. And as the desert settles into silence, The story drifts backward to a time when this emptiness first gained a purpose. Before there were fences, signs, or numbers attached to this place, there was only land. Not land in the abstract sense used on maps, but land as it exists when no one is watching it closely. Quiet, broad, unconcerned with attention. The Nevada desert did not announce itself as important. It did not suggest purpose. It simply stretched outward, mile after mile, under a sky that seemed too large for urgency. This was the Great Basin Desert, a vast region shaped, not by sudden violence, but by patience, by slow geological processes that unfolded over millions of years. Ancient lakes rose and vanished. Mountains lifted gradually, almost imperceptibly, pushed upward by forces too deep to be seen. What remained were basins and ranges, dry valleys and salt flats, repeating in a rhythm that felt endless. To stand here, especially at night, is to feel how small intention becomes. The ground is pale and firm, cracked in places where water once lingered. The air holds little moisture. Sound travels far, then disappears completely. Even footsteps seem hesitant, as if aware they are temporary. Long before any military surveyor arrived, this land already knew silence. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples moved through these spaces without attempting to dominate them. The Southern Paiute and other groups understood the desert not as empty, but as precise. Water sources were known. Seasonal rhythms were respected. Travel followed memory rather than markings. There were no fences because there was no need for them. Boundaries existed, but they were carried internally, passed down through stories, through experience, through careful attention to the land itself. A certain valley meant shelter. A certain ridge meant danger. A certain dry lake meant openness, exposure, distance. In this way, the desert functioned as its own map, one that did not need to be drawn. Some landscapes insist on being altered. Forests are cut. Rivers are redirected. Plains are divided. But deserts resist this impulse. They offer little to extract easily. They do not reward haste. They are indifferent to plans that do not account for their scale. Because of this, deserts often become places of projection. When there is little visible activity, the mind begins to supply its own. Emptiness invites interpretation. Stillness invites imagination. Long before Area 51 became a name whispered late at night, this land already carried that quality. It was a blank. Space in the psychological sense. A place where absence itself became meaningful. Early explorers and settlers passed through reluctantly. The desert was something to endure, not to inhabit. Accounts from the 19th century describe it as harsh, unforgiving, monotonous. Water was scarce. Landmarks were few. Orientation relied on distant mountains that never seemed to get closer. To cross it was to be temporarily unmoored. When the U.S. Geological Survey began mapping the region in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, their reports reflected this tone. The desert was cataloged, measured, named, but rarely celebrated. It was a region defined more by what it lacked than by what it offered. Groom Dry Lake appeared in these surveys as a pale, oval set among low hills. Flat, hard-packed, remarkably smooth. From above, it looked almost artificial, as if prepared deliberately. But it was not. It was simply the result of time, evaporation, and sediment settling layer by layer. To the surveyors, it was a geographic feature of mild interest. To later planners, it would become something else entirely. But that was far in the future. At this stage, The desert existed without purpose imposed upon it. There were no restricted zones, no classified airspace, no sense that one should not be here. The land did not repel people through force, only through inconvenience. And that inconvenience mattered. Remoteness is often mistaken for emptiness. In reality, it is a form of insulation. Distance slows movement. Isolation reduces observation. In a world where communication once traveled at the speed of horses and trains, places like this naturally fell outside the main current of attention. This is why deserts have so often been chosen for things meant not to be seen. Not because they are mysterious, but because they are overlooked. Before secrecy was formalized, it was implicit. Before security was enforced, it was geographic. The Nevada desert did not need walls. It needed only to remain itself. Even today, driving toward Groom Lake, one passes through long stretches where nothing seems to change. The road hums softly beneath tires. The horizon remains fixed. There are few signs to reassure you that progress is being made. This sameness has an effect on the mind. Thoughts slow. Urgency dissolves. The sense of time becomes elastic. Minutes feel longer. Distances feel abstract. It is easy to see how such a place could be useful to those who wish to work without interruption. But before any of that, it was simply a place where the land held memory quietly. Indigenous pathways, now mostly invisible. Geological events recorded only in stone. Human presence leaving traces too light to disturb the surface for long. This kind of land does not accumulate stories loudly. It absorbs them. And because so little was visibly recorded here, later imaginations would find room to grow. When no clear narrative exists, speculation settles in naturally. The desert does not correct assumptions. It does not clarify. It allows. In this sense, the psychological foundation of Area 51 was laid long before any official designation. The blankness came first. The silence came first. The feeling that something could exist here without being noticed came first. Maps from the early 20th century reflect this indirectly. Large swaths of Nevada appear sparsely labeled. Names are few. Details are minimal. The absence is not ominous. It is practical. There was little to note. And yet, absence has a way of drawing attention over time. As the modern world became more crowded, more observed, more documented, places like this stood out by contrast. They remained gaps in an otherwise filled-in picture. And gaps invite questions. Why here? Why so empty? Why so quiet? These questions would come later. For now, the desert rested in anonymity. The wind moved across Groom Dry Lake without obstruction. Dust lifted, then settled again. The sun rose and fell with no schedules. To observe. Night brought stars unobstructed by artificial light. The land did not anticipate being chosen. It simply waited. Out of this quiet emptiness, practical decisions began to take shape, slowly and without ceremony. When the desert finally drew attention, it was not curiosity that arrived first. It was calculation. The early 1950s were marked by a particular kind of urgency, quiet, bureaucratic, methodical. The Cold War did not announce itself with constant noise. Much of it unfolded in offices, on drafting tables, in meetings where voices stayed low and language stayed careful. Decisions were made not for spectacle, but for advantage. And places were chosen not for what they symbolized, but for what they allowed. Southern Nevada began to appear on internal discussions not because it was mysterious, but because it was useful. By 1951, the Nevada test site had already been established northwest of Las Vegas. Nuclear tests were being conducted there, deliberately far from major population centers, yet still close enough to existing infrastructure to be supported. Roads could be built. Personnel could be transported. Equipment could be moved without crossing international borders or densely populated regions. The desert, once again, proved cooperative in its indifference. This proximity mattered, not because of spectacle, but because of logistics. When the Atomic Energy Commission evaluated locations for testing, they were looking for predictable isolation, a place where outcomes could be measured without interference, where containment, physical, informational, and psychological, could be managed. Groom Lake sat quietly within this larger framework, not inside the Nevada test site, but close enough to benefit from the same assumptions, that what happened here would not be casually observed, and that mistakes, if they occurred, would dissipate into distance. It is easy, in retrospect, to imagine dramatic meetings where secrecy itself was the driving motivation. But records suggest something far more ordinary. The area was remote. The terrain was flat. The airspace was already sparsely traveled. And crucially, the land was already under federal control or could be brought under it with relative ease. Convenience has a way of masquerading as intention. From the perspective of U.S. Air Force planners, Groom Lake offered a rare combination of qualities. The dry lake bed functioned as a natural runway, long, flat, and forgiving. There was no need to build one from scratch. Aircraft could land and take off with minimal preparation. This alone made the location appealing for experimental work. Distance played its role quietly. The farther a site was from public roads, the less effort was required to secure it. The fewer people who passed nearby, the fewer questions would be asked. In an era before satellite imagery was widely accessible, observation required physical presence. And physical presence, out here, required commitment. The desert filtered out the casual observer. Airspace above southern Nevada was already considered flexible. Commercial routes tended to avoid the region due to its lack of navigational landmarks and destinations. This made it easier to designate large swaths as restricted without disrupting civilian traffic. The designation of restricted airspace did not need to be dramatic. It could be framed as routine safety, and it was. The language used in planning documents was measured, technical, and calm. Terms like test area, range, and restricted zone appeared repeatedly. There was no mention of aliens. No suggestion of recovered technology. Just aircraft, altitude, radar, and risk mitigation. The Cold War rewarded places that did not draw attention. What is often overlooked is how much secrecy depends on normalcy. The less unusual a decision appears, the less scrutiny it attracts. Choosing a desert site near existing military infrastructure was not surprising. It was expected. It aligned with precedent. In this way, Groom Lake benefited from being unremarkable. As the U.S. Air Force expanded its research and testing programs, the need for controlled environments increased. Experimental aircraft required space, both horizontal and vertical. They needed room to fail quietly, to be adjusted without interruption, to be observed without witnesses. Invisibility was not an aesthetic choice. It was a functional one. Distance from population centers meant fewer eyes on the sky. Even if something unusual appeared overhead, there would be fewer people to see it and fewer cameras to capture it. Reports, if they emerged at all, would be isolated, anecdotal, easier to contextualize or dismiss. This was not about deception. It was about probability. A place like Groom Lake reduced variables, reduced risk. reduced noise. The irony, of course, is that these same qualities would later amplify attention. But that was not yet apparent. At the time, the desert was simply doing what it had always done, remaining out of the way. The Atomic Energy Commission, tasked with overseeing nuclear development, understood the value of such spaces. Their work depended on containment not just of radiation, but of information. Test schedules, yields, outcomes, all of it needed to remain controlled. Southern Nevada had already proven itself capable of absorbing this responsibility. Once an area has been normalized as restricted, additional restrictions feel less conspicuous. This is how landscapes acquire layers of purpose. One use makes the next easier to justify. One fence makes another seem reasonable. One classified designation creates a precedent. Groom Lake did not need to be explained to the public because it was never introduced to them in the first place. What little acknowledgement existed was vague. A test range, a training area, language that implied activity without specifying its nature. Most people accepted this without interest. The desert did not demand explanation. It is important to pause here and notice how different this reality is from the mythology that followed. There was no grand reveal, no singular moment when Area 51 became a symbol. There was only gradual accumulation, layer upon layer of restricted use, each justified by practical need. Aircraft development required secrecy. Secrecy required isolation. Isolation was already available. The planning process did not need imagination. It needed efficiency. This is where the contrast begins to form. Between intention and interpretation. Between what planners saw and what later audiences would infer. For those inside the system, Groom Lake was a solution. For those outside it, it would eventually become a question. And questions, when left unanswered, tend to grow. The desert did not change during this transition. The mountains remained still. The dry lake bed reflected the sky as it always had. Only the context shifted. Fences appeared gradually, not as dramatic barriers, but as practical markers. Signs were placed not to provoke, but to deter. Warnings were clear, unemotional, and legally precise. Restricted. Authorized personnel only. There was no attempt to dramatize these boundaries. They were designed to fade into the landscape, not stand out against it. Beige signs against beige earth. Roads that seemed to lead nowhere in particular. The goal was not to announce importance. It was to maintain routine. And routine is powerful. It dulls curiosity. It normalizes exclusion. For years, this worked. The place functioned as intended. Aircraft came and went. Data was collected. Improvements were made. The desert absorbed the activity without complaint. It was only later, when fragments of information began to surface, when unusual aircraft silhouettes were glimpsed, when official acknowledgement remained absent, that imagination filled the gaps. But that belongs to another part of the story. Here, at the beginning, there was nothing theatrical about the choice. Just a confluence of geography, infrastructure, and timing. A landscape already accustomed to being overlooked, now tasked with being deliberately unseen. Perhaps this is the quiet truth beneath so many legends. That mystery often begins not with secrecy, but with convenience. Once the location was chosen, quiet lines were drawn that would never appear on ordinary maps. When the first lines were drawn at Groom Lake, they were not dramatic. They did not announce themselves as the beginning of legend, or even as something permanent. They were practical lines, measurements taken, markers placed, decisions noted quietly in documents that were never meant to circulate widely. If one could have stood nearby at that moment, there would have been little to see. A few vehicles, temporary structures, people moving with purpose, but without ceremony. The desert did not change its behavior. The wind still moved across the dry lake bed. The sun still bleached everything evenly. The silence absorbed the activity without comment. In 1955, the Groom Lake airstrip began to take shape in a way that would later be recognized as significant. At the time, however, it was simply an extension of what the land already offered. The dry lake bed, hardened by cycles of flooding and evaporation, was naturally suited for aircraft operations. It was flat, expansive, and forgiving, qualities that engineers value more than symbolism. No grand runway had to be poured immediately. The desert had already done most of the work. This was the beginning of infrastructure, but not yet of permanence. Early buildings were modest. Hangars, support facilities, temporary housing. Structures designed to serve a function, not to last longer than necessary. They sat low against the landscape, their colors chosen to blend rather than contrast. From above, if anyone had been looking, the base would have appeared incomplete, almost tentative, and that incompleteness mattered. Maps from this period tell an interesting story, not through what they show, but through what they leave out. Publicly available maps continued to depict Groom Lake as an unremarkable geographic feature. The dry lake bed might be labeled, or it might not. Roads leading toward it often stopped abruptly, fading into nothing. This was not deception in the dramatic sense. It was omission. Cartography has always been selective. A map is not reality. It is a decision about what deserves representation, what aids navigation, what can be acknowledged, what can be ignored. In the case of Groom Lake, omission became a tool. The public layer of mapping showed nothing unusual. No base name, no detailed layout, just empty space, perhaps crossed by a boundary line indicating federal land. To most viewers, this confirmed what they already believed. There was nothing there worth noting. But another layer existed beneath this one. Restricted maps, those circulated within military and intelligence communities, told a different story. On these, lines appeared where none existed publicly. Runways were measured. Buildings were labeled. Zones were delineated based on function and access. And beneath even those, there were internal layouts. Documents that never left specific offices. Diagrams that reflected not just geography, but workflow, movement, visibility, separation. These maps were not designed to inspire curiosity. They were designed to prevent it. Yet it is precisely this layering that later fueled imagination. When people began to realize that what they saw on public maps did not align with reality, questions formed naturally. What else was missing? What else had been deliberately left out? And if a runway could disappear from a map, what else might be absent? The idea of the map the public never saw begins here, not as a single artifact, but as a realization that mapping itself can be conditional. At Groom Lake, this conditionality was intentional. The airstrip itself evolved quietly, initially used to support a specific purpose, testing the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft. Developed by Lockheed Skunk Works under the leadership of Clarence Kelly Johnson, the U-2 represented a shift in how intelligence would be gathered. It was designed to fly higher than any interceptor of its time, above the reach of conventional defenses. This altitude requirement dictated everything else. The aircraft needed long runways, clear approaches, minimal interference. Testing could not be done near busy airspace or populated regions. Failures had to be contained. Successes had to remain unobserved. Groom Lake provided this environment almost effortlessly. From the ground, the early operations were quiet. Flights were scheduled carefully. Personnel were limited. Information flowed only where necessary. The base functioned like a sealed system, with each component aware only of what it needed to perform its role. From the air, however, something new was happening. Test pilots took off into skies that most people never occupied. The U-2 climbed higher than commercial aircraft, higher than military planes of the era. At those altitudes, the curvature of the Earth became perceptible. The sky darkened. The horizon softened. To observers on the ground, if they saw anything at all, the aircraft appeared strange. Its long wings reflected sunlight differently. Its altitude distorted perception. At dawn or dusk, it could catch light in ways that made it seem luminous, detached from conventional flight. Reports began to trickle in. Unfamiliar shapes, unusual movement, objects that did not behave as expected. At the time, these reports were contextualized internally. Engineers and planners understood the cause. The aircraft existed on their maps, their diagrams, their schedules. But on public maps, there was still nothing. This mismatch between what was happening and what was acknowledged created a subtle tension. Not immediately and not loudly, but enough to be felt. The base itself continued to grow, incrementally. New structures replaced temporary ones. Support systems became more refined. Roads were improved, though they remained largely unmarked. Utilities were installed quietly, often underground, reducing their visual footprint. Still, the base did not announce itself. This restraint is worth noting. There was no effort to erase Groom Lake from existence. It simply wasn't highlighted. The goal was not invisibility through force, but invisibility through normalcy. If something is not labeled, most people will not look for it. And yet, absence has a curious effect on the human mind. When maps fail to align with experience, when rumors circulate that contradict official depictions, attention sharpens. People begin to examine edges more closely, to notice gaps, to ask why a place seems deliberately undefined. This is how imagination enters the map. The desert, once a blank space by default, became a blank space by design. And design invites interpretation. It is important to remain uncertain here. While we know some details about early infrastructure, much remains classified or was never documented publicly. Internal layouts, access protocols, specific building functions. These details exist only in fragments. Some believe that even the earliest internal maps were incomplete by necessity. That compartmentalization extended to cartography itself. One team knew one section. Another knew a different one. No single map contained everything. Whether this is true or not, the idea persists because it fits the logic of the place. Secrecy at Groom Lake was not centralized, it was distributed. And distributed secrecy does not produce a single hidden map. It produces many partial ones. As years passed, this reality became increasingly difficult to reconcile with public understanding. The more people learned about the U-2 program after its eventual acknowledgement, the more they wondered what else had followed the same pattern. If one revolutionary aircraft had been tested herein, silence, what else might have been? The desert did not answer. Maps remained selective. Aerial photography was limited. Satellite imagery, when it became available decades later, would reveal shapes, but not explanations. Runways could be seen. Buildings could be counted. but purpose remained abstract. And so, the first lines drawn at Groom Lake did more than establish infrastructure. They established a pattern, a relationship between visibility and omission, between what is shown and what is withheld. This pattern would persist, evolving as technology changed, but never disappearing entirely. The base existed simultaneously as a physical location and as an absence in public knowledge. A place you could point to on the ground, but not fully describe on paper. Perhaps this is why Area 51 would later feel less like a site and more like a question. Because from its earliest days, it occupied a space between acknowledgement and denial. The desert absorbed this duality without resistance. As structures appeared on the ground, new shapes began to form in the sky above. There was a moment, not marked on any calendar, when the sky above the Nevada desert began to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but subtly, in ways that were easy to miss unless you knew where to look, or unless you happened to be standing in the wrong place at the right time. In the years following the establishment of Groom Lake as a testing ground, the air above it became a laboratory, an empty volume of space, carefully managed, carefully observed, and largely unseen by the outside world. The desert below remained still, but above it, something new was taking shape. The U-2 program was among the first to redefine what secrecy meant in the air. Developed in the early 1950s, the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft was designed with a single purpose: to see without being seen. It was not built for speed or combat, but for altitude. Its long, glider-like wings allowed it to climb higher than any operational aircraft of its time, reaching heights where the sky darkened and the horizon curved gently away. From a technical standpoint, it was an elegant solution to a strategic problem. Satellites did not yet exist in practical form. Surveillance required physical presence, and physical presence required protection. Altitude provided that protection. Testing such an aircraft required conditions that were difficult to find elsewhere. The plane needed long, uninterrupted stretches of runway. It needed airspace free of traffic. It needed weather patterns that could be predicted with some reliability. And it needed isolation, so that when something went wrong, as experimental aircraft often do, the consequences could be contained. Groom Lake offered all of this without complaint. The U-2 took to the sky quietly. Flights were planned meticulously. Takeoffs often occurred in early morning or late evening, when the air was calmer and observation less likely. The aircraft climbed steadily, its profile becoming increasingly unfamiliar as it ascended beyond conventional expectations. To those involved in the program, nothing about this was mysterious. The aircraft existed in blueprints, test reports, and engineering discussions. Its behavior was understood. Its limitations were documented. But to those outside this context, the sight of such an object could be disorienting. At extreme altitudes, the U-2 reflected sunlight differently. At dawn or dusk, when the ground below was already dark, the aircraft could still be illuminated by the sun. This created the illusion of a glowing object moving silently across the sky. Its speed, relative to perception, was also deceptive. At such heights, movement appeared slower, smoother, almost detached from the rules that governed lower altitude flight. Reports began to surface. Pilots flying commercial routes noticed something above them, something higher than expected. Civilians, particularly in rural areas, described objects that did not resemble known aircraft. The reports were often tentative, uncertain. People struggled to describe what they had seen. These were not dramatic accounts. They were confused ones. Internally, the overlap was understood. The timelines aligned. Sightings correlated with test flights. Explanations existed. Externally, there was silence. The U-2 program was classified. Its existence could not be acknowledged without revealing capabilities. And so, when questions arose, they were deflected gently. Weather balloons, atmospheric phenomena, optical illusions. None of these explanations were entirely false, but none were complete. This gap between experience and explanation was small at first, barely noticeable, but it would widen over time. As technology advanced, so did the aircraft tested at Groom Lake. The A-12 Oxcart program followed, pushing boundaries even further. Designed for speed and altitude, the A-12 introduced new shapes into the sky. Its sleek, angular form was optimized to reduce radar cross-section. Its engines produced unique visual effects, especially during high-speed flight. The aircraft operated at speeds and heights that challenged existing understanding. Heat shimmered along its fuselage. Vapor trails formed and dissipated in unfamiliar patterns. Sound lagged behind movement, creating moments where the sky seemed to act independently of what was seen. Again, to engineers and test pilots, these were predictable outcomes of advanced design. To observers without that context, they were anomalies. The State Route 71 Blackbird, developed from the A-12, would later become one of the most recognizable aircraft ever built, once it was acknowledged. But during its early testing phases, it existed only as a rumor. A shape glimpsed briefly. A sound heard after the fact. Its presence reinforced a growing sense that the sky was no longer behaving as expected. What is important to understand here is that none of this required extraterrestrial explanations to feel unsettling. Human technology alone had begun to outpace public awareness. Secrecy accelerated this gap. CIA reconnaissance programs operated under layers of classification that limited knowledge even within government circles. Information was compartmentalized. Engineers knew one aspect. Pilots knew another. Analysts saw only data, not aircraft. This fragmentation ensured security, but it also ensured that no single narrative could easily emerge. Outside this system, people filled in the blanks. Folklore does not arise from nothing. It grows in spaces where information is partial and experience is vivid. When individuals witness something they cannot categorize, and are then told that nothing unusual occurred, the mind seeks alternatives. In the 1950s and 1960s, the language to describe advanced aerospace technology did not yet exist in popular culture. There were no stealth bombers in museums, no declassified diagrams in textbooks. The idea that human-made aircraft could fly so high, so fast, and so silently felt implausible. So other explanations surfaced. It is said that some early UFO reports were quietly correlated with U-2 test flights. Records suggest that officials were aware of this overlap, even as they maintained public ambiguity, not to deceive maliciously, but to protect programs deemed essential. Secrecy, in this way, became a generator of myth, not by intention, but by consequence. As newer aircraft entered testing cycles, the pattern repeated. Each advancement introduced new visual and acoustic signatures. Each signature produced fresh confusion. Each explanation withheld allowed imagination to expand. The desert sky became a canvas once again. What had changed was not the land, but the altitude at which mystery operated. Technology, when unseen, often feels unnatural. When its mechanisms are hidden, its effects can seem otherworldly. This is not a flaw in perception. It is a natural response to unfamiliar stimuli. And Groom Lake specialized in unfamiliarity. Aircraft that redefined speed redefined sound. Aircraft that redefined altitude redefined light. Aircraft designed to evade detection redefined expectation itself. All of this occurred incrementally, quietly, without public milestones. The base did not announce breakthroughs. There were no press releases, no demonstrations. Progress happened behind closed doors and beyond visible horizons. This created a temporal dissonance. The future arrived early here, but remained undisclosed elsewhere. Over time, this dissonance became part of the Area 51 identity, not because of what was proven, but because of what was suspected. The sky above the desert felt different, not threatening, but unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity invites stories. It is worth noting how calm this process was from the inside. Engineers focused on performance metrics. Pilots focused on safety margins. Analysts focused on data interpretation. There was no sense of participating in legend-making. Legend-making happened elsewhere. The desert absorbed sound. The base absorbed information. And the public absorbed fragments. As aircraft testing intensified, access to Groom Lake became more restricted. Not suddenly, but methodically. Layers of clearance were refined. Movement was controlled. Knowledge was segmented. The sky was becoming busier. The ground needed to become quieter. And so, without announcement, the infrastructure below adapted. Not just physically, but administratively. Secrecy matured into a system rather than a condition. As the sky grew busier, the ground below became increasingly compartmentalized. For a long time, Area 51 occupied a peculiar state of being. It was not hidden in the way people imagine hidden things. It was not erased, disguised, or aggressively denied. Instead, it existed in a quieter condition, unacknowledged. Not confirmed. Not described. Not discussed. It was present without being present, known without being named. This kind of absence is difficult to explain because it does not behave like a lie. It behaves like a pause. For decades, when asked directly, officials did not say that Area 51 was something else. They simply said nothing at all. Questions met with deflection, redirection, or carefully worded statements that addressed everything except the place itself. And this silence became one of its most defining features. In an age where denial often provokes resistance, non-acknowledgement does something subtler. It leaves no surface to push against, no claim to contradict, no story to dismantle. There is only an empty space where an answer might have been. That empty space invites attention. To understand how unusual this was, it helps to consider how governments typically behave. Most military installations are named, cataloged, and publicly acknowledged at least in outline. Their purposes may be vague, their activities classified, but their existence is not in question. They appear on maps. They are referenced in budgets. They are visited by officials. Area 51 was different. For years, its name did not appear in official documents accessible to the public. It was not listed among Air Force bases. It was not acknowledged in press briefings. Even when journalists or researchers raised the question directly, responses were carefully constructed to avoid confirmation. This was not an accident. Classification language is designed to manage information, not erase it. Terms like black site, special access program, or compartmented facility exist to create controlled visibility. But in the case of Groom Lake, even the category was withheld. The base was not denied. It was unnamed. This distinction matters because denial invites contradiction, while non-acknowledgement invites imagination. As years passed, people noticed this pattern. They noticed that aircraft were tested somewhere in Nevada, but the location remained undefined. They noticed restricted airspace on flight charts without corresponding installations. They noticed budget anomalies, redacted lines, vague references to test ranges with no coordinates attached. The absence became conspicuous. In 1966, the Freedom of Information Act was signed into law, introducing the idea that citizens could request access to government records. It did not guarantee disclosure, far from it, but it created a formal process for asking questions. Requests began to be filed. Some asked about specific aircraft programs. Others asked about facilities. Others simply asked whether a place known as Area 51 existed at all. Responses, when they came, were often heavily redacted. Pages released with entire paragraphs blacked out. Names removed. Locations obscured. In many cases, the most notable feature of these documents was what they did not say. Classification language appeared frequently, but always indirectly. Phrases like, "the agency can neither confirm nor deny," became familiar. This phrasing was not designed to provoke. It was designed to close the conversation without escalating it. But to the public, it felt like a door that would not open. Over time, this pattern shaped perception. Silence was no longer interpreted as neutrality. It was interpreted as significance. If nothing were happening there, people reasoned, why not simply say so? This logic is understandable, but incomplete. Governments do not always respond based on what is happening, but on what might be inferred. Acknowledging a site's existence can imply its importance, even if its activities are mundane. And yet, the longer the silence lasted, the more meaning it seemed to carry. Journalists began to reference the base cautiously. Researchers wrote around it, rather than about it. Pilots spoke in fragments. Workers remained anonymous. Even within official circles, references were oblique. The base existed in a linguistic shadow. It is worth noting how calm this period was. There were no mass briefings, no public confrontations, no dramatic moments where officials stood before cameras to defend secrecy. The base was protected not by argument, but by omission. Silence, it turns out, is difficult to challenge. This silence also had a psychological effect. When information is withheld consistently, people begin to assume intention behind the withholding. They begin to look for patterns. They begin to connect unrelated dots. Stories accumulate not because they are encouraged, but because they are not resolved. The phrase Area 51 itself did not originate as a public brand. It was an internal designation, functional and unremarkable. But when it surfaced, through leaked documents, offhand comments, and secondary sources, it took on weight quickly. Numbers feel official, impersonal, designed to conceal rather than explain. The name became a stand-in for everything unknown about military secrecy. Not just a place, but a concept. Still, officially, nothing existed. This state persisted well into the late 20th century. Even as other classified programs were acknowledged retroactively, Groom Lake remained absent from confirmation. The U-2 program was eventually disclosed. The State Route 71 was revealed and celebrated. Formerly secret aircraft appeared in museums. But the place where much of this work occurred remained unnamed. This selective acknowledgement reinforced the idea that the base itself was different, that it held something beyond technology, something beyond aircraft. And yet, records suggest that internally, the base was treated pragmatically. It had maintenance schedules, security protocols, personnel rotations. It functioned like a place of work, not a myth. The myth grew elsewhere. In 2013, a shift occurred. The CIA released declassified documents that, for the first time, explicitly referenced Area 51 by name. The acknowledgement was understated, almost casual. It appeared not as a revelation, but as a footnote in the history of the U-2 program. There was no announcement, no press conference, just a document. For some, this confirmation felt anticlimactic. For others, it felt validating. The base existed. It always had. But the acknowledgement raised more questions than it answered. If the base could now be named, what had changed? Why now? And what still remained unnamed? The silence had not ended. It had simply shifted. Even after 2013, details remained sparse. The acknowledgement confirmed existence, not purpose. It did not provide maps, layouts, or operational descriptions. It did not address speculation. It did not close loops. In a way, it reinforced uncertainty rather than resolving it. This is the paradox of secrecy. The more carefully it is maintained, the more attention it draws. The longer it persists, the more meaning it acquires. Area 51 became a lesson in this dynamic. Classification language continued to shape discussion. Terms like special access program suggested depth without revealing content. Need to know implied layers without defining them. Compartmentalization hinted at structure without providing overview. Each term offered shape without substance. And so, the public relationship with the base evolved. It was no longer just a place that didn't exist. It was a place that existed only in fragments. Fragments invite assembly. Some assembled them into theories. Others into skepticism. Many into quiet curiosity. Late at night, the idea of a place that officially did not exist felt less threatening than comforting. A reminder that not everything is explained. That not every story has an ending. Silence, after all, can be restful. The desert does not mind being unnamed. The land does not react to acknowledgement or denial. It remains. Perhaps that is why this silence endured for so long. Because it aligned with the character of the place itself. No declarations. No clarifications. Just continued absence. And within this absence, deeper structures quietly formed. Not just in concrete or steel, but in policy, in habit, in language. Layers built upon. Layers, unseen, unspoken. Within this silence, deeper layers quietly accumulated beneath the surface. When a place refuses to explain itself, attention naturally turns downward. Not upward into the sky, where aircraft can be seen, however briefly, but beneath the surface, where nothing is visible at all. Beneath the ground, where imagination feels freer, and where absence can stretch without resistance. At Area 51, this downward pull has been persistent. For decades, some have believed that what exists above the desert floor tells only part of the story. That the visible structures, the hangars, runways, roads, are merely the surface expression of something deeper. Something concealed not by distance or silence, but by Earth itself. These ideas did not emerge suddenly. They accumulated slowly, much like sediment. Each layer of secrecy encouraged another layer of speculation. And over time, the notion of underground facilities became one of the most enduring features of the Area 51 narrative. It is important to approach this carefully. There is no public confirmation of vast subterranean cities beneath Groom Lake. No official schematics showing endless tunnels or hidden laboratories stretching for miles. What exists instead are fragments, patterns, precedents, and plausibility. And sometimes, plausibility is enough to sustain belief. From an engineering perspective, underground facilities are not unusual. Throughout the Cold War, hardened military structures were built beneath mountains, deserts, and plains. Bunkers designed to withstand blasts. Command centers buried deep enough to survive worst-case scenarios. Storage facilities hidden below ground to protect sensitive materials. These were not science fiction. They were responses to a world that had learned how fragile surface infrastructure could be. Nevada's geology, in particular, lends itself to this kind of construction. Beneath the dry, cracked surface lies a complex composition of sedimentary layers, volcanic rock, and compacted soil. Certain areas are stable enough to support tunneling. Others are less forgiving, but still workable with sufficient resources. Engineers have long known how to carve space underground when needed. The question, then, is not whether underground facilities are possible. It is whether they exist here, and to what extent. This is where certainty fades. Some believe that early planners, concerned about observation from above, would naturally move sensitive operations below ground. That underground hangars could house experimental aircraft away from satellites. That laboratories could operate without leaving thermal signatures. That deeper layers could be shielded from both surveillance and intrusion. Others argue that the cost and complexity of such construction would outweigh the benefits, especially when surface secrecy had proven sufficient for decades. Both positions exist without resolution. What fuels the belief, perhaps more than anything, is the logic of depth itself. When something is hidden, it feels intuitive that it would be hidden downward. When answers are withheld, they seem to sink rather than float. Depth feels permanent, protected, final. This psychological association is powerful. In storytelling, depth often symbolizes truth. What lies beneath is assumed to be more real than what lies on the surface. In landscapes, depth suggests stability. In secrecy, it suggests intent. So when people imagine Area 51, they imagine layers. Gates leading to corridors. Corridors leading to chambers. Chambers leading to deeper chambers still. Darkness becomes a feature, not a flaw. Cold War bunker design reinforces this imagery. During that era, entire command systems were built underground. Facilities like Cheyenne Mountain were openly acknowledged after their construction, demonstrating that such projects were not only feasible, but operationally preferred. If these existed elsewhere, why not here? The desert, after all, offers more than isolation. It offers cover. Excavation can occur with minimal visibility. Spoil can be dispersed. Activity can be concealed by scale. And yet, none of this confirms anything. What we are left with is a space where imagination and engineering overlap. A place where belief is supported not by evidence, but by coherence. The story makes sense, even if it cannot be proven. It is worth noticing how calm these ideas often are when stripped of sensationalism. Underground facilities are not inherently frightening. They are practical. They are quiet. They are controlled environments designed to reduce uncertainty. In this way, the image of depth beneath Area 51 is almost soothing. It suggests order, structure, deliberate design. Rather than chaos, it implies containment. Darkness, too, takes on a gentler role here. Not as something threatening, but as something protective. A buffer between sensitive work and an unpredictable world. A space where variables can be managed. Many who contemplate these subsurface possibilities do so not out of fear, but out of curiosity, a desire to understand how far secrecy extends, how deep the layers go, and perhaps more importantly, what that depth says about us. Humans have always associated hidden knowledge with underground spaces, ancient temples carved into rock, tombs sealed beneath earth, vaults buried for safekeeping. Even memory itself is often described as something stored deep within. When a modern site resists explanation, it is almost inevitable that the mind reaches for this metaphor. Area 51 did not invent this tendency. It inherited it. Still, there are limits to what can reasonably be assumed. Large-scale underground construction leaves traces, geological disturbances, logistical footprints. While some evidence may be classified or obscured, total concealment over decades would require extraordinary effort. This does not negate the possibility. It simply introduces restraint. And restraint is important. Here, the most compelling aspect of subsurface theories is not their detail, but their persistence. They endure because they satisfy a narrative need. They give form to secrecy. They turn absence into architecture. In doing so, they offer comfort to those who feel unsettled by unanswered questions. Depth suggests that answers exist, even if they are inaccessible. But whether these underground layers are real or imagined, they serve a similar function. They remind us that not all landscapes are experienced equally, that some places invite projection simply by withholding clarity. The desert surface at Groom Lake remains unchanged, flat, exposed, quiet. If something exists beneath it, it does so without announcement, without vibration, without acknowledgement. And that, too, aligns with the character of the place. Nothing here demands belief. Nothing insists on disbelief. The ground remains firm either way. Perhaps the enduring fascination with what lies beneath Area 51 says less about the base itself and more about how humans relate to secrecy. How we cope with boundaries we cannot cross. How we imagine continuity where there is interruption. Depth becomes a way of thinking through uncertainty. It allows questions to rest without needing resolution. Whether real or imagined, these ideas reveal as much about people as about places. Every place, no matter how restricted or abstract it becomes in the public imagination, is ultimately shaped by people. Not heroes, not villains, not symbols, but individuals who arrive on time, perform specific tasks, and leave again at the end of the day. At Area 51, this human presence has always existed quietly, almost invisibly, woven into the fabric of routine rather than drama. The base may be spoken about as if it operates on its own, sealed and autonomous, but it does not. It never has. Lights do not turn on by themselves. Aircraft do not prepare themselves. Systems do not maintain their own order. People do that. And yet, the people who work here are rarely discussed, and even more rarely seen. Each weekday morning, before the desert heat fully asserts itself, a small, unmarked fleet of aircraft departs from a terminal at McCarran Airport in Las Vegas. The planes are plain. White bodies, red stripe. No logos that draw attention. No passengers who linger. These are often referred to as Janet Airlines flights, a name that has circulated unofficially for years, its origins unclear, its meaning never formally explained. The flights operate on a schedule that appears routine. They take off, they land, they repeat. Passengers board quietly. No announcements are made about their destination. Boarding passes do not list where they are going. To an outside observer, It might look like any other commuter flight, except for one detail. No one ever disembarks at a visible terminal on the other end. They simply vanish into the desert. This daily movement tells us something important. Whatever Area 51 is, it is not sustained by isolation alone. It depends on regularity, on people who wake up, commute, and return home. This is not a permanent exile. It is a job. Those who work there are often described in abstract terms: engineers, technicians, analysts, security personnel. Roles defined by function rather than identity. Their names rarely appear in print. Their faces are not photographed. This anonymity is not accidental. It is a condition. Compartmentalized clearance levels govern not just what employees can share with the public, but what they can share with each other. One person may understand a system without knowing its purpose. Another may interpret data without knowing its origin. Knowledge is segmented deliberately, creating a structure where no single individual holds a complete picture. This fragmentation serves security, but it also shapes experience. Imagine working in a place where curiosity must be restrained, where questions are not discouraged aggressively, but simply unnecessary, where the scope of one's task is defined narrowly, and exceeding it is neither rewarded nor encouraged. This kind of environment does not feel cinematic. It feels procedural. Most days are likely unremarkable. Maintenance checks, calibration, documentation, meetings that focus on timelines rather than implications. The language used is technical, precise, stripped of narrative. Silence becomes part of the workflow, not the silence of fear, but the silence of professionalism. A mutual understanding that certain topics are not discussed, not because they are dangerous, but because they are irrelevant to the task at hand. This kind of silence can be surprisingly ordinary. Many military contractors are accustomed to it. Their careers are built around discretion. They sign agreements, undergo background checks, accept boundaries. The expectation is not secrecy as mystery, but secrecy as hygiene, something maintained automatically, without emotion. At Area 51, this culture appears to have intensified. Workers are transported together, yet remain separate in knowledge. They share a destination, but not necessarily a narrative. Lunchrooms exist, but conversations are careful. Not paranoid, just limited. The base itself reinforces this distance. Its layout, whatever its specifics may be, is designed around access control. Badges open some doors, not others. Paths are defined. Movement is purposeful. Over time, this structure becomes internalized. Employees learn not just where they can go, but where their thoughts are expected to stop. Not through enforcement, but through habit, through repetition, through the understanding that boundaries exist for reasons that do not need to be explained. This does something subtle to a person. It creates emotional distance, not from the work, but from the larger story surrounding it. The myths that circulate outside the fence feel disconnected from daily reality. Speculation becomes background noise, faint and irrelevant. Inside, the focus remains narrow. And yet, no one works in total isolation from the world. At the end of the day, the Janet flights return. People go home. They re-enter ordinary life. This transition must be strange, even if it becomes routine. To spend hours in a place that officially did not exist for decades, and then to stop for groceries on the way home. To work on systems that cannot be discussed, then to attend a child's school event. To hold information that cannot be shared, even casually, even vaguely. This duality requires compartmentalization of a different kind. Some former workers have suggested, carefully, years later, that the hardest part was not the secrecy itself, but the absence of acknowledgement. The inability to explain what one does, even in general terms. The necessity of deflection. What do you do for work? Becomes a question with no satisfying answer. Over time, this can erode a sense of authorship over one's own life. Achievements cannot be celebrated. Challenges cannot be explained. The work exists, but only internally. In this way, Area 51 asks something specific of its workforce. Not sacrifice in the dramatic sense, but surrender of narrative. The story of the work belongs to the institution, not the individual. And yet, people continue to show up. This suggests something else at play, professional pride, perhaps, or a sense of contribution to something larger, even if that something remains undefined. For many, the work itself may be enough. The satisfaction of solving problems, improving systems, advancing capability. Not everyone needs an audience. It is also possible that the quiet attracts a certain kind of person. Those who prefer structure. Those who are comfortable with limits. Those who find reassurance in routine rather than recognition. Area 51 does not reward visibility. It rewards reliability. The desert reinforces this ethos. There are no distractions. No nearby towns to wander into. No casual visitors. The environment encourages inward focus. And when work is done, the place empties again. At night, the base does not hum with human presence. Lights may remain on. Systems may continue to operate. But people leave. The desert reasserts itself. This rhythm, arrival, work, departure, repeats day after day, year after year. It does not require myth to function. It requires consistency. And yet, knowing that human lives pass through this place daily complicates its image. It is no longer just a symbol of secrecy. It is a workplace. A quiet one. A controlled one. A place where extraordinary technology may exist alongside ordinary routines. Coffee breaks. Checklists. Shift changes. There is something grounding about this realization. It reminds us that even the most enigmatic locations are sustained by human effort, by people who are not thinking about mystery, but about tasks. When people leave a place each night, the place remains, listening. Maps are rarely just about geography. They pretend to be. They present themselves as neutral tools, lines, symbols, coordinates meant to help us navigate from one place to another. But beneath that surface, maps carry something quieter and more personal. They tell us what is known, what is acknowledged, and, just as importantly, what is not. At Area 51, this distinction becomes especially clear. For decades, people have searched not only for information about the base, but for representations of it. Diagrams, layouts, floor plans, satellite images annotated with meaning. Even speculative drawings passed quietly between forums and books. The desire is not simply to know what exists there. It is to see it laid out, to hold it mentally, to make it navigable. This impulse runs deep. Cognitive mapping theory suggests that humans are constantly building internal maps, not just of physical spaces, but of concepts, relationships, and systems. We orient ourselves in the world by forming mental structures that explain how things connect. When those structures are incomplete, discomfort arises. A missing road on a map is unsettling. A blank area invites attention. The mind wants continuity. In the case of Area 51, the absence of reliable maps created a persistent cognitive gap. People knew the base existed, or at least suspected it did, but could not place it fully within an understandable framework. It resisted orientation. This resistance made it compelling. When cartographers omit information, it is usually for practical reasons. Scale limitations, relevance, security. But omission is not neutral. It draws the eye to what is missing. It suggests that something lies just beyond the edge of representation. This is especially true in cultures shaped by secrecy. During the Cold War, entire categories of knowledge were deliberately withheld. Programs existed that could not be named. Budgets were allocated without explanation. Facilities operated without acknowledgement. This created an environment where information asymmetry was not the exception, but the norm. Some knew. Most did not. Maps, in this context, became symbols of access. To possess a more complete map was to possess privilege, insight, control. And when people do not have access, they imagine. The map the public never saw does not need to be a literal artifact to feel real. It exists as a psychological object, a mental construct shaped by partial data, rumors, and inference. Each person's version is slightly different, but they share a common structure, layers. There is always a surface layer, what is officially acknowledged, then a hidden layer, what is believed to exist beyond that, and sometimes a deeper layer still, what feels too significant to be visible at all. This layering mirrors how humans process uncertainty. When faced with incomplete information, the mind does not stop. It fills in gaps using pattern recognition, analogy, and narrative. This is not irrational. It is adaptive. It allows us to function in complex environments where full information is rarely available. But it also means that absence becomes generative. Area 51's lack of detailed public maps did not discourage interest. It sustained it. The base became a mental landscape people could revisit repeatedly, refining their internal map with each new fragment of information. A runway spotted on satellite imagery. A fence line traced on a hiking map. A road that seems to lead nowhere. Each detail becomes a landmark. Over time, this internal mapping provides a sense of comfort. Even without certainty, familiarity develops. The unknown becomes structured, not solved, but organized. This is why the question, "What's really there?" often matters less than the act of asking it. The search itself becomes grounding. Control plays a role here as well. To map something is to reduce its power over us. To name, outline, and position a place is to feel less subject to its mystery. Even speculative maps offer this relief. They give shape to uncertainty. And yet, Area 51 resists even imagined completion. Every map, official or unofficial, feels provisional, subject to revision, incomplete by design or by necessity. This keeps the internal map active, flexible, alive. Curiosity, in this sense, is not agitation. It is maintenance. Late at night, when the world quiets and attention turns inward, these internal maps resurface. Not as urgent puzzles, but as familiar mental paths. Places the mind knows how to wander through without effort. The desert, the fence, the runway, the unseen spaces in between. There is something soothing about returning to a mystery that does not demand resolution. A question that has learned how to coexist with daily life. In this way, Area 51 functions less like a secret to be uncovered and more like a constant reference point. A reminder that not all systems are transparent, that some knowledge remains deliberately uneven, and that this unevenness, while frustrating at times, is also stabilizing. Total knowledge can be overwhelming. Complete maps leave no room for imagination. They close loops too tightly. The partially hidden map, by contrast, breathes. As the narrative slows here, it is worth noticing how little effort it takes now to think about this place. The initial tension has softened. The outlines are familiar. The absence has become a feature rather than a flaw. The mind knows where the gaps are, and knowing where gaps exist can be enough. Over time, even unanswered questions begin to feel familiar. There is a certain kind of sighting that does not arrive with panic. It does not involve alarms or urgency, or the sudden sense that something has gone wrong. Instead, it appears quietly, almost gently, at the edge of awareness. A light that moves differently than expected. A shape that lingers longer than it should. A moment where the sky seems to hesitate. Many of the reports associated with Area 51 belong to this quieter category. They are not stories of invasion or threat. They are stories of interruption, of ordinary routines briefly unsettled by something unfamiliar, and then resumed. People look up, observe, and return to what they were doing, carrying with them a question they may never fully articulate. These moments accumulated over time, especially in the decades following the expansion of flight testing in southern Nevada. Some reports came from pilots, others from ranchers, truck drivers, hikers, or residents of small desert towns. The descriptions varied, but patterns emerged. Objects seen at unusual altitudes, movements that seemed smooth, deliberate, unconcerned with gravity in the familiar way. Lights visible at dusk or dawn, when perception is most easily distorted. It is important to say this carefully. These observations were real experiences. Whatever caused them, people saw something that did not fit neatly into their expectations. Acknowledging that does not require assigning a definitive explanation. During the mid-20th century, as sightings gained public attention, the U.S. Air Force initiated Project Blue Book. Its stated purpose was to investigate reports of unidentified flying objects and determine whether they posed any threat to national security. The language used was clinical, observational, detached. Project Blue Book did not approach sightings as proof of extraterrestrial life, nor did it dismiss them outright. It categorized them, analyzed patterns, sought correlations. In many cases, explanations were offered, whether balloons, aircraft, astronomical objects, atmospheric effects. In other cases, reports remained classified as unidentified. This designation has often been misunderstood. It did not imply alien origin. It simply meant insufficient data. But ambiguity has weight. What makes the Area 51 connection persistent is not any single report, but the overlap in timing. Records suggest that spikes in UFO sightings often coincided with periods of intense flight testing. High-altitude aircraft operating beyond public awareness naturally produced unfamiliar visuals. From the ground, these tests could appear anomalous. From within classified programs, they were expected. This duality created parallel realities. Those with access to test schedules saw patterns that made sense. Those without access saw interruptions that defied explanation. Both perspectives were valid within their own informational boundaries. The National UFO Reporting Center, established later, became a repository for civilian accounts. Reading through these reports today, one is struck not by fear, but by uncertainty. Witnesses often express hesitation. They qualify their descriptions. They admit doubt. "I don't know what it was," appears frequently. This humility is telling. Many reports describe objects that did not behave aggressively. They did not approach. They did not signal. They simply passed through the field of view, and continued on their way. The observer was left alone with the experience. Such encounters do not demand conclusions. They invite reflection. Atmospheric optical phenomena complicate matters further. The desert environment is particularly conducive to mirages, light refraction, and unusual visual effects. Temperature gradients can bend light. Ice crystals at altitude can scatter illumination. The human eye, especially at night, is easily misled. None of this negates the sincerity of witnesses. It contextualizes it. High-altitude test flights added another layer of complexity. Aircraft operating at the edge of known performance envelopes produce effects that were unfamiliar at the time. Contrails that appeared suddenly. Sonic booms delayed or displaced. Lights reflecting at angles that defied expectation. In the absence of explanation, the mind searches for categories. And when existing categories fail, new ones emerge. Unidentified becomes a placeholder. Not a claim, but a pause. It is worth noticing how little emphasis there was on fear in many of these accounts. This is not the language of threat. It is the language of curiosity mixed with restraint. People did not feel pursued. They did not feel endangered. They felt puzzled. This tone aligns with the broader character of the Area 51 phenomenon. Quiet, distant, observed rather than experienced directly. Over time, as test programs evolved and some were declassified, portions of this puzzle became clearer. The U-2 and State Route 71, once sources of confusion, were now understood as human achievements. Their silhouettes, once unfamiliar, became iconic. But clarity did not erase memory. People remembered what it felt like to see something before it had a name, before it could be explained. That feeling lingered, even after explanations arrived. And for some sightings, explanations never fully materialized. Project Blue Book eventually concluded that UFOs did not pose a threat and that there was no evidence of extraterrestrial origin. The program was closed in 1969. Official interest waned. Public attention shifted. Yet the reports did not stop entirely. They softened, became less frequent, less urgent. The noise faded. What remained were echoes, stories retold quietly, often years later. Experiences shared cautiously, without insistence. Memories that resisted neat classification. In this way, UFO sightings around Area 51 became part of a larger cultural background. Not front-page news, but ambient mystery. Something that could be returned to in moments of reflection. Late at night, when the sky feels closer and the world feels less defined, these stories surface again. Not as evidence, but as atmosphere. They remind us that perception is shaped by context. That understanding often arrives after experience, not before. And that some moments resist closure entirely. Area 51 did not create these sightings. It provided a setting where they could occur without immediate explanation. A place where the gap between observation and acknowledgement was wide enough to hold ambiguity. And ambiguity, when it is not forced toward resolution, can be surprisingly gentle. As years passed, the noise faded, leaving only echoes. Time behaves differently in places that are closed. It does not stop, of course. Days still turn into nights. Seasons still pass across the desert floor. But the way time is felt, measured, remembered, spoken about, changes when a place is removed from ordinary observation. At Area 51, time has moved in a way that feels almost circular. Decades have passed, yet much appears unchanged. The fences still stand. The airspace remains restricted. Official descriptions, when they appear at all, remain sparse. The base has existed through entire historical eras, the height of the Cold War, its gradual cooling, the transition into a digital age, without ever fully stepping into public clarity. This continuity is unusual. Most places age visibly. Buildings weather. Purposes shift. Names change. What was once new becomes obsolete, then nostalgic. Time leaves marks that are easy to trace. But in restricted places, aging is often internalized. The outside world moves forward, while the restricted zone maintains a controlled present. Upgrades happen quietly. Systems are replaced without announcement. Personnel rotate. Yet the overall identity of the place remains fixed. Area 51 has been many things across the decades. Testing ground, development site, logistical hub, but its public posture has remained remarkably consistent, undefined. This consistency creates a sense of suspension. When information is not updated publicly, the mind assumes stasis. If nothing new is said, nothing new must have happened. The story freezes, even as reality continues to evolve behind closed doors. Declassification timelines reinforce this effect. Documents are released years, sometimes decades, after their relevance has passed. What once felt urgent arrives as history. The delay flattens emotion. Revelations feel muted, archival rather than immediate. By the time something is acknowledged, it has already aged. This rhythm teaches patience, whether intentionally or not. During the Cold War, secrecy was framed as temporary necessity. Certain information could not be shared yet. Once tensions eased, disclosure might follow. That expectation lingered for years. But the Cold War ended, and Area 51 remained. The world changed around it. Borders shifted. Technologies accelerated. Communication became instantaneous. And still, the base continued its quiet routine. This endurance transformed waiting into a feature rather than a phase. People began to realize that secrecy here was not a placeholder for future openness. It was a stable condition. Something maintained not because of crisis, but because it worked. Long-term restricted zones operate on this principle. They are designed to outlast individual projects. Their value lies in continuity, in the ability to absorb change without drawing attention. From this perspective, Area 51 is not frozen. In time, it is insulated from it. The desert helps with this illusion. Its landscape changes slowly. A mountain looks the same year after year. A dry lake bed does not advertise age. Without vegetation to mark growth or decay, the environment feels static. This stillness amplifies the sense that nothing is happening, even when something is. For observers outside the fence, the lack of visible change becomes its own story. Years pass without update. Generations grow up hearing the same name attached to the same mystery. Parents pass speculation to children, often unchanged. The story does not advance. It repeats. And repetition has a calming effect. When a mystery does not escalate, it becomes familiar. Its edges soften. It becomes part of the background rather than a source of tension. Area 51, once shocking, has become ambient. This does not mean interest disappears. It simply changes texture. Curiosity becomes quieter, less urgent, more reflective. People no longer wait for a reveal. They wait because waiting is what one does with this place. The base, in turn, waits as well. It does not respond to speculation. It does not adjust its silence to match attention. It continues on its own schedule. Government archival practices reinforce this separation. Records are stored, categorized, sealed. Release dates are set far into the future, often beyond the careers or lifetimes of those who created them. Time becomes layered, like sediment. There is the time of action, when work is done, the time of classification, when that work is hidden, and the time of release, when it becomes history. Area 51 exists mostly in the second layer. This creates a peculiar relationship with memory. Events are remembered before they are acknowledged. Stories circulate without documentation. By the time documents appear, the emotional moment has passed. What remains is a sense of duration. The place has been there a long time. It will likely remain there longer still. This endurance encourages a slowing of thought. There is no deadline here, no countdown, no expectation of closure. The desert does not hurry. Neither does secrecy. At night, this realization can be comforting. To know that some questions are not meant to be resolved quickly, that some narratives unfold at a pace far slower than human attention spans. Area 51 invites this perspective simply by existing unchanged. It reminds us that time does not always move toward explanation. Sometimes it moves toward quiet familiarity. Eventually, even mystery grows quiet. Silence is often misunderstood as emptiness. We tend to think of it as the absence of sound, the absence of information, the absence of intention. But in certain places, especially places shaped by long-term secrecy, silence is not an absence at all. It is a structure. At Area 51, silence appears to have been designed. Not dramatically, not forcefully, but patiently. Layer by layer, decision by decision, silence became something that could be maintained, relied upon, and trusted. It was not imposed as a reaction to danger. It was built as a condition of stability. This distinction matters. Many people imagine secrecy as active suppression, documents shredded, voices silenced, truths aggressively hidden. But the kind of secrecy practiced here feels different. Quieter, less urgent. It resembles insulation more than obstruction. Soundproofing rather than censorship. Information control doctrine does not rely on silence as an end goal. It treats silence as a medium, a space in which only what is necessary travels, and everything else remains still. The purpose is not to deceive, but to contain. In this system, silence becomes functional. At Area 51, explanations were not withheld to provoke curiosity. They were withheld to reduce complexity. Each explanation creates new questions. Each acknowledgement opens additional pathways for inference. Silence closes those pathways gently. This is why leaks, at least credible, detailed ones, have been so rare. Not because people are constantly watched, but because the system does not encourage accumulation of complete knowledge in any one place. When no one holds the full picture, there is nothing whole to leak. Compartmentalization models are central to this design. Tasks are separated. Information is distributed narrowly. Context is minimized. People know what they need to know, and little else. This reduces risk, but it also reshapes how silence feels from the inside. When you do not expect answers, their absence does not disturb you. Over time, silence becomes ambient. Like the desert at night, it is simply part of the environment. Security culture theory suggests that the most effective systems are those that feel natural to the people within them. Rules that are constantly enforced through fear tend to break. Rules that are internalized tend to persist. At Area 51, silence appears to have been internalized. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It does not require constant reinforcement. It exists as an understanding, shared but unspoken. This kind of quiet does not feel threatening to those accustomed to it. It feels protective. Protection here does not mean hiding something dangerous. It means shielding work from distraction, shielding people from scrutiny, shielding systems from misinterpretation. In this sense, silence functions like a barrier that does not need to be seen to be effective. From the outside, this can feel unsettling. Humans are conditioned to equate silence with concealment. When no explanation is offered, suspicion fills the space. But from within the system, silence can feel like relief. There is no need to justify, no need to clarify, no need to perform transparency. Work proceeds without commentary, without interruption. The absence of leaks over decades suggests not just enforcement, but alignment. People operating within this environment appear to accept silence as part of the job, not as a burden, but as a boundary. Boundaries, when respected, create calm. This calm is often overlooked in discussions of secrecy. We focus on what is hidden, not on what is stabilized. We assume silence exists to keep something in, rather than to keep chaos out. But consider how noise behaves. It spreads. It distorts. It demands response. Silence, by contrast, absorbs. At Area 51, silence absorbed speculation, attention, and time. When rumors circulated, there was no response. When stories escalated, there was no correction. When expectations grew, they were met with the same stillness as before. This consistency prevented escalation. If secrecy had been defended aggressively, it might have invited challenge. If denials had been issued repeatedly, they might have provoked contradiction. But silence offered nothing to engage with. It simply remained. This is why silence can be the most stable structure of all. It does not require maintenance in the way explanations do. It does not age the way narratives do. It does not contradict itself. Silence does not need to be updated. The desert supports this design naturally. Its vastness dampens sound. Its emptiness discourages congregation. Its monotony smooths over variation. Even the wind moves without urgency. At night, especially, the quiet feels complete. Not tense. Not anticipatory. Just settled. This atmosphere seeps into the mind of anyone who lingers with it long enough. The absence of explanation begins to feel less like a missing piece and more like an intentional pause. A space left open on purpose. And open spaces are not always meant to be filled. Silence also protects those within it. Workers are spared public scrutiny. Their efforts are not mischaracterized. Their lives remain private. The work is allowed to exist without becoming spectacle. This protection extends outward as well. The public is spared incomplete narratives, half-formed explanations, technical details removed from context. Silence prevents misunderstanding as much as it prevents disclosure. In this way, the quiet surrounding Area 51 is not aggressive. It is conservative. It preserves equilibrium. As the decades passed, this design proved resilient. Political climates shifted. Technologies evolved. Media cycles accelerated. Yet the silence held. It did not need to compete for attention. It outlasted it. For those who approach this subject seeking revelation, this can feel unsatisfying. But for those seeking rest, there is something deeply calming about a mystery that does not chase resolution. A place that does not demand belief or disbelief. Just quiet acknowledgement. Silence, here, becomes a kind of landscape. One that can be entered without effort. One that does not surprise. One that does not escalate. And as the narrative descends towards stillness, this quiet takes on a different quality. It is no longer something to analyze. It is something to inhabit. In that silence, the mind begins to rest. After all the years of looking outward, toward fences, runways, documents, and skies, it becomes possible to notice something quieter. The most complete map of Area 51 may not exist on paper at all. It may exist only in thought, not as a fixed diagram, but as a shifting internal landscape, shaped by fragments of information, pauses in explanation, and long stretches of waiting. A map drawn not with coordinates, but with impressions, with questions that have learned how to rest without answers. This idea requires a gentle reframing. For much of this journey, the map has felt external, something withheld, restricted, hidden behind classification. A thing that could, in theory, be revealed if the right archive were opened or the right document released. But over time, another possibility emerges, that the most meaningful map was never meant to be seen, because it was never meant to exist outside the mind. Epistemic uncertainty, the understanding that knowledge has limits, is not a failure of reason. It is a condition of being human. We live within partial views. We navigate using approximations. We accept that some things are known indirectly, if at all. Area 51 has become a focal point for this realization. It sits at the intersection of fact and imagination, not because it blurs them intentionally, but because it allows the boundary to remain soft. What is documented does not fully explain what is experienced. What is experienced does not fully resolve into fact. And so, the mind builds its own structure. This structure is personal. No two internal maps are identical. One person's map may emphasize aircraft and engineering. Another's may focus on secrecy and policy. Another's may drift toward speculation, symbolism, or myth. Each is shaped by what the individual brings with them, their interests, their questions, their tolerance for ambiguity. In this way, the unseen map becomes a mirror. Philosophy of knowledge reminds us that understanding is not just about accumulation of facts, but about how those facts are arranged. Meaning arises from context, from relationship, from narrative. Area 51 offers very little narrative closure. And so, people supply their own. This is not deception. It is interpretation. Narrative psychology suggests that humans organize experience through story, even when events are incomplete. We look for beginnings, middles, and endings. When endings are absent, stories remain open. They become places we can revisit. Area 51 has remained open-ended for so long that it has become familiar. Its unanswered questions no longer feel sharp. They feel worn smooth by repetition. Curiosity, here, no longer rushes forward. It lingers. This lingering is important. There is a difference between curiosity that demands satisfaction and curiosity that coexists with uncertainty. The first creates tension. The second creates space. Over time, many who return to this subject notice a shift. The urgency fades. The desire to know everything gives way to a quieter appreciation of not knowing fully. The mystery becomes atmospheric rather than confrontational. This is where the internal map stabilizes. Instead of expanding endlessly, it settles into a shape that feels complete enough. Not complete in detail, but complete in feeling. The outlines are there. The gaps are acknowledged. The boundaries are understood, even if they are not defined precisely. Symbolic cartography helps explain this process. Symbols allow us to represent complex realities without reducing them entirely. A mountain on a map does not capture every rock, every slope, every shadow, but it is sufficient for orientation. The internal map of Area 51 functions similarly. The desert. the fence, the runway, the silence. These symbols recur. They anchor thought. They provide reference points that do not require elaboration. And between them lies open space. This open space is not empty. It is restful. Accepting partial knowing does not mean abandoning curiosity. It means releasing the pressure placed upon it. Curiosity no longer needs to resolve into answers. It can remain exploratory, reflective, even meditative. This is a subtle shift, but a meaningful one. The mind no longer scans for revelations. It wanders. Late at night, when attention softens and the world narrows, this wandering becomes easier. The story of Area 51 transforms from a question to be solved into a place to visit mentally. A landscape of thought rather than a problem. This transformation prepares the way for closure, not in the sense of resolution, but in the sense of rest. Fact and imagination no longer compete. They overlap gently. Each informs the other without needing to dominate. What is known grounds the story. What is imagined gives it depth. And neither needs to win. In this balance, the unseen map becomes complete in its own way. Not because it contains everything, but because it no longer demands more than it can hold. The desert remains where it has always been. The base continues its work, whatever that may be. Documents remain classified. Some are eventually released. Most are not. And the internal map adjusts accordingly. It does not collapse under uncertainty. It accommodates it. This is perhaps the quiet lesson offered here, that not all mysteries are invitations to uncover, expose, or conclude. Some are invitations to slow down, to sit with not knowing, to let questions exist without sharp edges. Area 51 has endured not because it promises answers, but because it has never rushed to provide them. And so, the map that exists only in thought becomes enough. Enough to orient curiosity. Enough to occupy reflection. Enough to allow the mind to settle. The story does not need to go further. It does not need to reveal more. It has reached a place of equilibrium. And so, the story gently releases its questions into the night. As the story loosens its grip, the desert returns to itself. There is no signal that marks this moment. No sound that announces an ending. The transition is gradual, almost imperceptible, like the cooling of air after sunset. 1 degree at a time. 1 breath at a time. The Nevada desert does not rush toward night. It eases into it, allowing warmth to drain slowly back into the earth. Out here, darkness is not an event. It is a condition. The land releases the heat it gathered during the day. Stone cools. Sand settles. The vast sky deepens from blue to indigo to black, stars emerging without urgency, one by one, as if remembering their places. This is how the desert rests. And now, so can you. There is nothing here that needs to be held on to. No detail that must be remembered. No conclusion waiting to be reached. The story has already done what it needed to do, not by answering questions, but by softening them. Area 51 remains where it has always been. Quiet. Unresolved. Unchanged by attention. Its fences do not glow at night. Its runways do not announce themselves. The restricted airspace. Above it stays empty and dark, indistinguishable from the rest of the sky. Whatever happens there happens without performance. And whatever you imagined along the way is free to fade. The human mind is not designed to stay alert forever. It moves in cycles, guided by rhythms older than curiosity. Circadian patterns gently pull attention downward, toward stillness, toward rest. The body responds before the mind fully understands. Breathing slows. Muscles loosen. Thoughts begin to repeat, then thin out. This is not something you need to manage. It happens on its own when given the right conditions. The desert night provides those conditions naturally. Temperatures drop. Air grows denser. Sound travels less, absorbed by distance. Even the wind, when it moves, does so without insistence, soft across the ground, barely shaping the silence. Silence here is not empty. It is full of space. There are no alarms in this place. No deadlines. No final truths waiting just out of reach. The mystery remains, but it no longer asks anything of you. It does not need to be believed. It does not need to be dismissed. It simply exists, and you are allowed to let it exist without effort. If thoughts drift back to runways, or maps, or lights in the sky, that is fine. Let them pass through gently, like clouds crossing a dark horizon. They do not need to settle. They do not need to connect. The desert does not connect everything. It allows separation, distance, gaps. Those gaps are restful. In sleep aid traditions, monotony is not a flaw. It is a tool. Repetition without escalation tells the nervous system that nothing is changing, nothing is approaching, nothing needs attention. The mind recognizes safety not through stimulation, but through consistency. The desert offers this consistency naturally. Night after night, it cools. Night after night, it darkens. Night after night, it remains. Area 51, for all its layers and legends, is part of this pattern. It does not intrude on the night. It does not compete with the stars. It rests within the same darkness as everything else. And so can you. There is no need to revisit earlier questions. No need to trace the story backward or forward. The narrative has reached a place where movement is optional. You may still be aware of sound, this voice, perhaps, or the quiet of the room around you. But even that can fade into the background. Auditory monotony works best when it becomes indistinct, when words blur into tone and rhythm rather than meaning. If you notice that happening, let it. Guided relaxation does not require participation. It requires permission. Permission to stop evaluating. Permission to stop tracking. Permission to stop anticipating. Nothing is going to happen next. The desert night confirms this. It has no surprises planned. No revelations waiting for the perfect moment. It does not escalate toward dawn. It simply holds the dark until light returns on its own schedule. Somewhere far away, Groom Lake lies flat and pale under the stars. No movement is visible from here. No activity announces itself. The land looks the same as it did before there were names, before there were fences, before there were stories. This sameness is not boring. It is stabilizing. You do not need to stay with the image. You can let it dissolve. The mind is free to wander elsewhere or nowhere at all. If sleep comes, allow it to arrive without comment. If it takes time, that is also fine. The desert is patient. Mystery does not have to be resolved to be peaceful. In fact, unresolved mystery often rests more easily than answers, because it does not require upkeep. Answers must be defended, revised, remembered. Mystery can simply be left alone. Area 51 has taught that lesson quietly over many decades. And now, the lesson no longer needs to be considered. The night deepens. The temperature steadies. The silence holds. Nothing more is required. Good night.